Well, my involvement came when a Sydney-based consulting firm, which also had a branch office in Singapore, decided to put in a bid for the contract that was being offered by the United Nations to participate in the what was the precise title of it? It was the Urban Development and Renewal Project in United Nations terms, and the firm was needed to acquire some additional staff in order to undertake the project, because the United Nations tender called for a very specific list of qualifications, and very few firms would have had them already on hand, as it were. So the successful tenderers, Crooks, Michelle, Peacock, Stewart, had asked me to join with them in preparing the response to the United Nations invitation to bid for the project, and we were fortunately successful. And I think one or two people in Singapore were a bit astonished at this, because they only knew Crooks, Michelle, Peacock, Stewart as people who did air conditioning and various things like that, and didn't know them as having any of the appropriate skills for planning. So I think it was Hao Yun Chong who first voiced that kind of reservation. Why do we get mechanical engineers, electrical and mechanical engineers to do our planning? So anyway, we managed to overcome those objections, and things went very smoothly from there on. And on the government side, right from independence, it had a strong view that a good physical plan, environmental plan, land use and transport plan, all integrated into one, was an essential basis for building the economy and diversifying the economy in the way that was necessary, because at that time the economy was largely dependent on entrepot type activities, which doesn't leave a lot of scope for growth in the future. And of course, unemployment was fairly high at the time, and quick development was needed in different ways. It was the government's initiative, of course, to seek United Nations help because of the fact that it had comparatively little expertise, because the senior people had all gone home. And apart from Kante Kui, I think there was hardly any of the Singapore people who had experience at any sort of senior level. So one of the emphasis in the specification that the United Nations put out to tender was to provide, as well as expertise in conjunction with the Singapore government staff, to provide what they termed on-the-job training. So people who had gone abroad, come back recently qualified, and of course didn't have, at that stage, practical experience. Hopefully they got useful practical experience out of the project, but they were active participants in it, and that was the basis for on-the-job training, if you like, which means the trainers sit back and invite the trainees to do the work for them. And it was very valuable work too, of course. And as a consequence, as I'm quite sure you know, many of those who were involved with the project went on to senior positions in other roles. Right from the beginning, the government had been foresighted enough to send a number of people abroad to various universities to do planning courses.
Yeah.
Because nearly all the senior people in the planning department up to that time had been British expats. And when independence came along, most of them went home. So there were a lot of gaps to fill. But the initial credit, I think, for the whole scheme has to go back to the Singapore government, which took the initiative to seek United Nations help. And when our team came on board, it had created an organisation known as State and City Planning, into which all the people who were going to be involved were moved from their existing departments, perhaps. But at the same time, the government was very intent on seeing full participation and involvement and cooperation of government instrumentalities who were going to be largely responsible for all the physical implementation of emerging plans, and bodies like the Housing and Development Board, for instance, who were not specifically involved directly in the project, were nevertheless advisors and who were consulted by the project on the way through, because after all, they were going to be left with the task of implementation. So we needed to be sure that what was being done was not inconsistent with what the various Singapore authorities were satisfied with, if you like, and prepared to underwrite it to the extent of saying, well, yes, we can cope with that, or no, we don't want to see any development over there because. So those were things which were taken into account. One of the requirements of the United Nations specifications was that while we were charged with the task of producing a concept plan, the insistence was that we should examine alternative concepts from the beginning and make a selection of those to give us a basic outline concept which could be developed into what it eventually became. to facilitate the examination of alternative concepts. We did set up some very outline constraints which concept plans should have, would have, and gave everyone, or almost everyone involved in the project, the task of preparing their own outline concept plan. And that became the basis from which to make a choice. And then we had to find ways, of course, of testing the various concepts. And the basic, the most significant element was to find concepts which would minimise the transport task, particularly in the working city, so that the relationship of workplaces and living places was of very basic importance. So anyway, having got a series of outline concepts, we had roundtable discussions about these, and eventually, and perhaps fortunately, came to a unanimous conclusion as to which one was the one that really ought to be developed. And that was what we termed the ring plan, I think, at the time. And that turned out to be a good choice. So it seemed to us at that time. Whether it really was a good choice is perhaps up to you to say. Minimising the travel task was a very important component of the ultimate selection. Almost all the concepts did that anyway. It was more or less embodied in the briefs that people were given. So the choices, I guess, or the way people voted in favour of one or other of the alternatives was based on intuition as much as anything. And a good deal of discussion as to why this might be a better way of going about things than that, and so on. And one of the obvious basis for choice was flexibility in implementation. In other words, we didn't want a concept which demanded development in certain parts at the initial stages, but rather one which allowed physical development to start in different places. And that, of course, made the task of implementation a good deal simpler. And made it easier to make full use of existing infrastructure, particularly. Well, I suppose Harry Wardlaw was very central to the whole thing. He was our prime liaison with the government, and he, of course, kept in very close touch with the minister, who was Eddie Barker at that stage, Minister for National Development, and he also took a considerable personal interest in what was going on. So there was always a bit of chit-chat backwards and forwards as to what might be a good thing and what might not. And we had to involve, fairly soon it became apparent that it would be highly desirable to move the international airport. Partly because it was its opportunities for future development on the old site were pretty limited. And of course it was necessarily a fairly central consideration in the whole development of the plan, or the transport part of it anyway. And that led us fairly soon to the conviction that it was not viable to continue with the old site. And I think everybody involved, in the way of, quite apart from the planning team, other development authorities like the Housing and Development Board and others were of the same view. And Changi became the obvious alternative choice. One reason being that it greatly minimised the noise problem as it affected Singapore. Probably gave Malaysia a bit more noise than it had before. That didn't seem to cause any international recriminations. So all was well there. But we needed to get an early decision from the government on that choice of airport site, because otherwise we would have had to prepare concept plans which took into account the possibility that we might end up with Paya Lebar or we might end up with Changi. And that would have been a considerable nuisance and a considerable led to a considerable amount of confusion into people who were going to have to implement the plan. And the only objection came from the Minister for Communications, who, of course, whose department had recently acquired land for a second runway at Paya Lebar. So his department and the Minister were not at all keen to see their pet plan go down the drain. So that minister was the only one who made strong objection. But the choice was really determined when Lee Kuan Yew, in delivering an election address at Kallang, I think, was drowned out by low-flying aircraft, and announced at the end of his speech that by such and such a date, I think what it was, the international airport will be at Changi. But the Minister for Communications didn't read the signs and took on another job, put it that way. And one of the project people was shunted into Parliament in the way they had it in those days. I don't know whether it still works like that. And became Minister for Communications. And he, of course, was committed to the program that was being developed by the project.
Was this Ong Ting Chong?
And that rings a bell, yeah, I think that was. He went on to become president anyway. That's right. It was Ong Ting Chong, I think it is. No, we did urge that there was a great deal of the old Singapore which was worthy of conservation, but at that point it didn't cut much ice with the government, and it was quite a bit later down the track, I think, before anything very significant was done about the conservation of buildings, anyway. Conservation in the sense of open spaces and reserves and so on was, I think, accepted generally. We didn't have to do much argument about the desirability of reserving some of the major reserves which appeared in the plan, especially the areas around Bukit Timah, I think, in the centre of the island. And it's obvious, actually, from what I've seen the last couple of days, that a great deal of the original natural vegetation has been preserved, and a great deal more planting has gone on as well. So that I think Lee Kuan Yew had a catchphrase at that time, Singapore green and clean.
What about the historical buildings, though, the preservation of the historical buildings?
Well, initially that didn't cut much ice either.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the historical buildings particularly that we were advocating for. But eventually the possibilities for conserving those buildings economically, as I believe has been done, by leasing them to private developers on condition that all sorts of things were conserved, but it led on to mean that these buildings had an economic use, and therefore there was much greater interest in conserving them than would have been the case if they'd simply been kept as historic remnants to stand back and admire, but not to actually use. So market forces were brought into play to strengthen the argument for conservation and to provide methods of financing it. Well, some of that, I think, came from the United Nations specification that we were required to provide some short-term guidance as well as the long-term concept plan. So the staged development of the concept plan became of some importance. And the first necessity, of course, was a rational population projection as to what was actually going to happen. And that was carried out by one of our people who was billed as a statistician in the United Nations specification of the project. That was Ernie Trelaw. And he produced a long-range population forecast, a couple of alternatives, as I recall, as to the ways in which the Singapore population was likely to grow in the future. And that provided the basis for saying, well, for the near future in the planning and in development, we're looking at a population of X, Y, Z, whatever it was. There is a monograph which is referred to in the concept report, which sets out all Ernie Trelaw's work. He compiled that, and that became the basis for what went into the concept plan. And that's in the archives, I believe. The Department of Planning, Singapore Department of Planning, remained in control of development control. They were the approving authorities for whatever went on and so on. And Tan Jak Hui, who led the State and City Planning Group, remained the chief planner as well. So there was very close interrelationship between the development approvals that were being granted at that stage and what was happening in relation to the concept plan. There wasn't a conflict, fortunately. There could have been other ways things had been organised differently. Well, yes, I think that was reflected in some of the early concepts, which became the basis for the ultimate choice. Places like Copenhagen, for instance, have got a very particular development form, which may or may not be applicable elsewhere. But that was one, I think, that came up. And indirectly, concepts like that did feed into the process of preparing the concept plan, because we had, as well as the people who were directly involved with the development project itself, there were review panels set up by the United Nations from time to time, who had some very cluey people on them. Some of the names, for instance, who had considerable experience elsewhere. I noticed Dennis Winston, who was Professor of Town and Country Planning, as it was called then, in the university. He was Professor at Sydney University and had in the recent past been involved in quite a lot of planning development in the United Kingdom. And concepts like the English New Town concept, for instance, had a significant influence. But it had, I think, more prominent influence on the plan that preceded the project, which was very much influenced by the colonial staff, which was recruited from the United Kingdom. But the New Town concept really didn't fit Singapore very well. There was one proposed, I think, up towards the northwest corner of the island. which had already begun some development, I think. But as it turned out, nobody really wanted to go and live there, so Housing Development Board was left with quite a bit of surplus stock, I think. Hadn't been involved in a project of this size or complexity, if I may say so, up to this time. I was principal planner with the State Planning Authority of New South Wales when I joined the concept team. And that authority was, well, not the authority so much, but the state government was not so audacious as the Singapore government. And consequently, the State Planning Authority did not do a great deal of planning, which was comparable in size and complexity to what emerged in Singapore. And there weren't any overseas examples that we were aware of which could really form a model for Singapore. Cities have problems which are general to all cities, but we were very specific, I think, in saying that what we would endeavour to do if we got this job was to apply principles from elsewhere, but not models from elsewhere. And I think we were successful in doing that or not doing that. So that the principles involved in the concept plan really emerged from work in Singapore, not from elsewhere. I had been through Singapore very quickly on a couple of occasions, but I didn't see any development of this on the scale of what I see now, and it was quite astonishing to me. And I sort of scratched my head and said, was that how it was supposed to look? Because the three-dimensional aspect didn't really come into the concept plan considerations apart from the question of density. How you achieved the density was really a matter for somewhat later consideration.